Video games and horror have gone hand in hand since the beginning. The first horror game was called Haunted House from back in 1972. Although I personally think that a case can be made for Pong being Lovecraftian cosmic horror, but that's just me. But there's been tons of adaptations of horror games into films, and we're going to go through those here today. Now, we're not covering everything here, and maybe we will in a later episode, but we're not covering strictly international films, since there's like 100 Japanese films based on games. And we're not covering animated films based on horror games. Again, maybe later, but for now, it's game on. And let's see if we can get through this episode with a big screen saying, "You died" on it. As far as I can tell, the first horror film based on a video game is 2002's Resident Evil. This one was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, and his version was the culmination of several attempts to get it made. There was an attempt by George Romero at one point, but his version never made it past the script stage as it was deemed too violent for what they wanted to go for. The film itself doesn't really adapt the events of the games all that much, instead branching off and telling a new story, although elements from the first and second games are utilized. It introduces the character of Alice, and instead of being mostly in this big old gothic mansion, the majority of the film occurs in an underground lab. It was a huge hit, bringing in over $100 million at the box office worldwide on a budget of merely $33 million, even though it didn't do that well critically, and game fans were disappointed with all the variations it took from the source material. The floodgates were now open, and video games were open season as far as adapting went, and the next one came a year later, in 2003, with the rather infamous House of the Dead. This one was based on a series of light gun games from Sega that were seen as kind of a variation on Resident Evil, so it only seemed appropriate that this one would be the next one to wind up on the big screen. It was directed by Uwe Boll, a man whose name we're going to be hearing a lot during this video, and much like RE, this is not a direct adaptation of the game. In fact, Boll called it a prequel to the original game, with one of the main characters revealed to be the villain of the series. The game protagonists, Rogan and G, make a very brief appearance as well, and the budget was $12 million and did not do well upon release, only bringing in around $14 million. But the big disaster was in the reviews and opinions of those watching. It would very quickly earn a title of being one of the worst films ever made, although one that was pretty silly. It would also start controversy around Boll being one of the worst directors of all time, leading him to emerge as a combative defender of his own reputation, leading to him even boxing some critics. The success of the first Resident Evil ensured a sequel, and one came a mere year later in 2004 with Resident Evil Apocalypse. It would pick up right where the first film left off, with Alice returning and the zombie virus getting loose into the general population, infecting all of Raccoon City. Mila Jovovich returned, and again it branched into its own story, but still incorporated some elements from the games, and introduced game characters Jill Valentine, Carlos Oliveira, and the villainous Nemesis. Anderson would not return as he was busy elsewhere, so Alexander Witt took over as director, and it's weird because even though this did well, he didn't really go on to do more stuff, and instead stayed as a second unit director, although for some pretty big projects. It had a slightly higher budget than the first one at $43 million, and did very well, earning around $130 million, although the reviews were generally poor, and has some of the worst of the entire series. 1 year later, in 2005, Uwe Boll came back to try again with Alone in the Dark. This was based on a PC game series with the same name from the early 90s that was loosely based on H.P. Lovecraft. At the time that the movie was released, there had been about 4 episodes of it, plus a side story, and the film would adapt the 4th installment called Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. It had Christian Slater, Tara Reid, and Stephen Dorff in it, and was given a strong budget of $20 million, but there were massive alterations to the script made during the filming process. It was originally meant to be more of a thriller, detective story until Boll revamped it into some sort of, action film. It fared even worse than House of the Dead did and is currently topped out at a 1% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences stayed away as well, and it only did around 13 million in ticket sales and developed an even worse reputation than House did. In that same year, there was another film that was on the opposite end of the spectrum, since it was a bigger release, bigger budget, and much bigger game, since that's when Doom came out. It was based on a 1993 game called Doom that was a first-person shooter and revolutionized the industry. It was also very controversial because of the amount of violence featured within, and started as a PC game, but quickly moved over to the consoles. The eventual film version was taken on by Andrzej Bartłowiak, and this guy was a very acclaimed cinematographer before shifting into action films like Romeo Must Die and Cradle to the Grave. It wouldn't be his only video game adaptation either, since he'd later on do Street Fighter, The Legend of Chun-Li, but that one's not horror, so we're not talking about that one on here. Doom had some star power involved, since The Rock was there, along with Judge Dredd and Rosamund Pike. And I mean, there's not really a ton of story involved in the game, but this one does cover most of what's presented there, and even has a sequence that's done in first-person shooter style. It was fairly pricey, with a tag of around 60 to 70 million, but got trounced by critics and underperformed, only bringing in a little under 60 million. I didn't quite realize how much exactly of this list would be Uwe Boll, but in 2006, he had yet another video game adaptation with BloodRayne. It was based on a console game from 2002 with the same title, and was a third-person hack-and-slash game with vaguely Tomb Raider-like mechanics. The movie would act as a sort of a prequel to the game and tell the story of Rain, the main character of the series. Kristanna Loken of Terminator 3 fame would step into the title role and would end up with a fairly solid roster of stars, like Michael Madsen, Billy Zane, Udo Kier, Meatloaf, Michael Pare, Michelle Rodriguez, and Ben Kingsley all played minor parts. Like Alone in the Dark, Boll ended up tossing a good portion of the script and did a lot of improvising, with the original screenwriter, Guinevere Turner, saying that only around 20% of her script was used in the finished product. It was Boll's biggest budget yet, costing $25 million, and getting a fair share more promotion than his previous two works. However, once again, critics tore it to shreds, and it turned out to be Boll's biggest disaster, only earning $3.7 million. 2006 was a big year for game adaptations, since it saw yet another entry, House of the Dead 2, although this one was made for the Sci-Fi Channel and then went straight to video, skipping the theater altogether. This isn't much connected to the games, with the exception of the Curian character, bridging it to the first film as well. However, it then goes in a completely different direction from both the original movie and the games. Boll wasn't connected to this one in any way, and instead Michael Hurst stepped in to direct, and it's generally considered to be a far more enjoyable film. I guess unless you're watching the original for the whole so bad it's good aspect of it. The cast list was smaller, although it had Sid Haig in there, as well as Future Blade, Sticky Fingers, and Nadine Velasquez of My Name is Earl fame. Also, look for a tiny appearance by future James Gunn's spouse and Peacemaker star Jennifer Holland. The budget looks to be around $6 million, around half of the first films, but since it didn't have a theatrical run, it's hard to tell just how successful or unsuccessful that it was. Later on in that very same year, there was another big one with Silent Hill. At the time, the game version was nearly as successful as Resident Evil, and was a spooky survival horror game full of mystery and fog. Lots of fog. The first game entry came out in 1999, and by this point 4 installments had been released, so it seems obvious to do a film version. It had a prestigious director with the French Christopher Gans, who had just come off of the acclaimed Brotherhood of the Wolf, but weirdly, it would be his last American movie. In fact, he only directed one movie after this, a French take on Beauty and the Beast, but is returning to the chair, and in fact, Silent Hill, with a new movie due later this year. This one had a nice cast with Radha Mitchell, Laurie Holden, Sean Bean, Deborah Unger, Kim Coates, and Alice Kriege, and a chunky budget of $50 million. Like a lot of the others here, it takes elements from the game but doesn't directly adapt any of them, instead using them as an aesthetic inspiration. And even though it didn't get great reviews, they weren't overly negative either. It was a hit though, earning around 100 million worldwide. We're moving on to 2007 now, and our first entry here is another one in the Resident Evil saga, with Resident Evil Extinction. It brings back the characters of Alice and Carlos, and also brings in the video game villain Albert Wesker, here played by Jason O'Mara, and Claire Redfield, played by Ali Larter. By this point though, very little of the game is adapted, and the film series has gone into its own direction, and it has the zombie plague spread worldwide. Originally, Jill Valentine was meant to return, but they decided instead to change the character and introduce Claire instead. The directorial reins were taken up by Russell Mulcahy, director of Highlander, and of course, Highlander 2, and they gave it a similar budget to the second one, at around $45 million, and it proved to be an even bigger success than that one, earning just under $150 million worldwide. However, much like the first two films, it received negative critical reactions. And hey, speaking of bad critical reactions, 2007 also brought us the second part of the BloodRayne series, with BloodRayne 2, Deliverance. Again, this didn't so much adapt the games as much as it did complement them, and this one moved the action forward in time to the Old West. Uwe Boll returned to write and direct, although this wouldn't get a theatrical run, instead going straight to video. And honestly, it's a wonder it was made at all, considering how much money that the first one lost. Kristanna Loken wouldn't return as the title character due to her commitments to the L Word and Painkiller Jane. And Natasha Malth would take over the part, and the only returning actor would be Michael Pare, although he's portraying a different character here. IMDb lists the budget as $10 million, although I have to admit that I sort of doubt that number, as it appears to be a much lower end picture than that. There's no box office to track, as it was a video premiere, but it has the distinction of being one of the films to maintain a 0% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Also in 2007 is another Boll entry, although this one possibly could have been left off here, since it's more action comedy than horror, but it's fairly violent, so I guess I'll include Postal. It's based on a 1997 game called Postal that was a very violent top-down shooter game that had some controversy around it because of the violent nature. Boll decided to do this one by embracing the more ridiculous nature of it and push it over the top. He cast Zach Ward, who shows up in a large number of Boll movies, and also had Dave Foley, Vern Troyer, and Michael Pare again. Surprisingly, it had a budget of $15 million and did get a theatrical run, but a more limited one. And when I mean limited, I mean that it was pared down from 1,500 screens to, 4. Boll blamed the pullback on political correctness due to the edgelord nature of the film, and he personally ended up contacting a number of theaters to run it there, and gradually increased the screen number to 21. However, it would still be a flop and earned less than $200,000 in its run, and won a Razzie for Worst Director. Man, I cannot believe how much of this early part of the list are either Boll films or sequels to them, because in 2008 there was Alone in the Dark 2. This one doesn't adapt any of the games in particular, and honestly doesn't even really seem connected to the first one, but it does have more of the feel of the games. Boll wasn't back to direct, and instead, Michael Roche and Peter Shearer would both write and direct. The duo were the writers on the original film, although as mentioned, their script was butchered and made unrecognizable. None of the original cast would return here, and that one's cliffhanger wouldn't even be resolved. And instead of Christian Slater, the main character of Edward Carnby would be played by Rick Yoon. Because of that, in between films, the character would change ethnicities from a white guy to Asian. It would also feature Lance Henriksen, Zach Ward, Bill Moseley, Danny Trejo, and to the surprise of no one, Michael Pare. This one had a budget of just under $5 million and actually did have a very, very small theatrical run, but only played a handful of theaters and only earned around $100,000. Jump ahead now to 2010, since I guess 2009 didn't have any horror adaptations in it, But in 10, there was the fourth entry in the Resident Evil series, Afterlife. This one marked Paul W.S. Anderson's return to the series, his first since the first one, and picks up right where the last one left off. Although, hilariously, the last film ended with Alice having a large number of her clones at her command, and I guess Anderson didn't much like that because they're all killed off in the opening of this one, leaving Alice on her own. Jovovich returned again, as did Larder as Claire Redfield, but this one added Wentworth Miller as Chris Redfield, another game character. Wesker comes back in this one, although he's recast as Sean Roberts, and there's a mid-credits scene featuring the return of Jill Valentine, again played by Sienna Guillory. This one did include some game elements adapted out of Resident Evil 5, including some mind-controlled devices and a battle between Chris Redfield and Wesker. The budget was increased from the third one to $60 million and was the first of the series to be done in 3D. And even though the reviews were, again, mostly negative, it made more than any of the previous entries and pulled in just over $300 million, making it a huge success. 1 year later, in 2011, it's back to Bowl Land with the release of BloodRayne, the Third Reich, which concludes the series. It fast-forwards the events to World War II and has our vampiric heroine facing off against Nazis, which is the closest to a game adaptation that the series had so far. Maltha would come back to play Rain, and both Michael Pare and Brendan Fletcher would appear, although they're playing different characters than they did in the previous entry, or, in Pare's case, Trees. There's also an appearance by Clint Howard in there, and again, IMDb says that it was made for $10 million, but ignore that because I'm thinking that's very wrong. This would again go straight to DVD, skipping theaters, and like the first two, was nearly universally panned. In 2012, there was yet another episode of the Resident Evil saga, the fifth one, and this one was called Resident Evil Retribution. Anderson was back to write and direct, and Mila Jovovich of course returned as Alice, and it would once again pick up where the last one left off. But what's funny is that much like the last one, the cliffhanger is resolved in about 3 minutes before it just moves on to a completely different story. The original intention was to do parts 5 and 6 back to back, but that was changed when it was decided to focus solely on the 5th entry instead. Whereas Claire is noticeably absent from this entry, it does introduce several new characters from the game that have not yet appeared in the movies, including Leon Kennedy, Ada Wong, and Barry Burton. Besides that, several characters that died in earlier films will be revived here in clone form, allowing for the return of Michelle Rodriguez as Rain, Colin Salmon as One, and Oded Fehr as Carlos. It had the heftiest budget yet at $65 million, slightly higher than Part 4, and was again in 3D. Like usual, reviews were bad, but sales were good, and the movie did $240 million worldwide, marking it as yet another success for the series. 2012 also saw another entry for that other big survival horror series with Silent Hill Revelation. Much like the first film, it doesn't directly adapt any specific game entry and is more of a version of the mood and atmosphere. Christopher Gans was originally meant to come back, but that was shortly after the first film came out, and several years went by with the film in development hell, and he eventually dropped out. The decision was then made to have the sequel be more commercially friendly, and MJ Bassett was brought on to both write and direct, and she had earlier done the Solomon Kane film with James Purefoy. Sean Bean, Rhoda Mitchell, and Deborah Unger would all return from the first one, and it would add Adelaide Clemens, Kit Harington, Carrie Ann Moss, and Malcolm McDowell to the roster as well. It had a much lighter budget than the first, at only $20 million, and like a lot of the films on this list, got pretty bad write-ups. But, also like a lot of the films here, it made money, earning $55 million, making it a moderate success. 2013 gave us our lowest profile entry so far, in terms of the movie, as well as the game that it's adapting, with Zombie Massacre. But here's the weird thing about this one, and maybe it doesn't truly belong on here, because there's a reason that this game is a little lesser known. It was a Wii game that was meant to be a take on Crazy Taxi, where you were driving a vehicle around and you'd have to race the clock and run over zombies along the way. While it was in development, the rights were snapped up by, you guessed it, Uwe Boll. He didn't direct this one though and merely produced it. Instead, it was handled by Luca Boni and Marco Ristori. It was a low-budgeted affair, made for $1 million, and doesn't really feature any names of note, and has a bioweapon being unleashed in Eastern Europe, which turns people into zombies. So a team of mercenaries is sent in to deal with it. But here's the thing, the game was never finished or released, so this is a case of a movie adaptation of an unfinished game. It was released direct to video, and like every other Boll film involved here, was savaged by critics. Skip ahead now to 2015, and we're getting more zombie action from Dead Rising: Watchtower. This one is based on a great third-person game that was on consoles and came out in 2006 that was famous for having a really large amount of zombies on screen at one time. But this actually wasn't the first adaptation, since there was a Japanese film in 2010 called Zombrex: Dead Rising Sun. But this was the first American go at it. It was directed by Zach Lipovsky, director of, Leprechaun Origins. And yes, I realize that it's hard to believe that anyone involved with that one had a career afterwards. It had Jesse Metcalfe as the main character, and had Rob Riggle as Frank West, the game series' protagonist. The movie doesn't totally adapt to the game storyline, but instead acts as a side story that is said to take place in between Dead Rising 2 and 3. It was released directly to Crackle, which is a thing, or was a thing. I assume it's still around. And the reviews were mediocre, with the main comment being that if you weren't a fan of the games, you might be a bit lost as to what's going on. Also in 2015, it's still all zombies all the time, since there was a direct-to-video release of Zombie Massacre 2: Reich of the Dead. Again, this isn't a direct adaptation of anything, since there was no game ever released, and doesn't have much to do with the first film either. It did have Luca Boni and Marco Ristori returning to write and direct, and takes place during World War II, acting as possibly a prequel. It again is said to be made for $1 million, and again, I think that's high, but there's no box office to speak of since it wasn't released that way, and no further entries were made. In 2016, though, a more direct zombie sequel appeared with Dead Rising: Endgame. Much like the first one, this was also made exclusively for Crackle and was again based on the game series. It picks up right where the last one left off and still takes place in the interim of the second and third entries of the game. Most of the cast returned, but this time around, Billy Zane would co-star. Lipovsky would not return to direct, but instead that role was taken on by Pat Williams. And he had done a long list of TV show episodes and TV movies before this one, and it appears to be his first and currently only feature film. Like the last one, there's no budgetary information out there, but it got better reviews all around, with most considering it a nice jump in quality from the first film. We go ahead to 2017 now, and we're looking at one that's again based on a lesser known game, with It Came from the Desert. This adapts a 1989 Amiga game that then branched off into some consoles, and it was a text-based point-and-click action game similar to Maniac Mansion, and was based on classic 50s sci-fi monster flicks. The film version rolls with that theme and features some giant ants and creatures and kept the throwback vibe. It was actually a Finnish film, but it's in English with American actors, and was directed by Marco Macalasco, and was co-written by Trent Haga of Terra Firma and Killjoy fame. It would be chock full of Easter eggs from the game, including text and music, and was generally well received and got good reviews, calling it fun and camp. 2017 also ended our saga for the film that kicked off this list, since we also saw Resident Evil: The Final Chapter. IMDb lists this one as 2016 since it premiered in mid-December of 2016 overseas, but it was a handful of screenings, and its main US release was in January of 2017. Paul W.S. Anderson came back to wrap things up, making him handle 4 of the 6 entries of the series, and Mila Jovovich, of course, comes back as Alice. It also has Ian Glenn return as his character from parts 2 and 3, as well as Ali Larter as Claire. and Sean Roberts as Wesker. It had a return to the Hive from the first film and brings back the Red Queen computer program and features a final showdown between the characters and the forces of Umbrella. Again, it was in 3D, with a lower than the past couple of entries budget of $40 million. And even though it had the lowest grossing US debut weekend of the series and underperformed in the US, it did really well worldwide and brought in $312 million, doing particularly well in China, where more than half of its haul came from. There was another zombie-themed one in 2017 with Dead Trigger, and holy crap, how many adaptations on this list are of zombie-oriented games? I'm gonna look. This is the 25th film I've covered, and of those 25, 16 have involved zombies. This one was based on a mobile game, the first one of those on here, and it's a first-person shooter game. The film version will be co-directed by Mike Cuff and Scott Windhauser, a first feature for each of them, and it involves the government needing agents to help them stop a zombie outbreak and developing a video game called Dead Trigger, the actual game, to help them recruit a team. Dolph Lundgren would star, along with Isaiah Washington, and was actually given a very limited theatrical release, playing a very select assortment of theaters, but then went quickly to on demand. Reviews were pretty rough as well, and it mostly quickly disappeared. We're nearer to the bottom of the list here since we're in 2019 now, and here's one that appeared early on the list, back for more, and it's Doom Annihilation. This is a complete reboot and didn't get much traction at first because the series was seen as a dead franchise. But then, in 2016, a new version of the game was released, and it was a hit, so Universal decided to greenlight a script that they already had from Tony Giglio, who had mostly done standard action films up to this point, but also Soccer Dog the movie. It once again roughly adapted the story of the game, and it's not said exactly how much was spent, but it didn't get a theatrical run, releasing direct to video. There's really no names of note in the cast, and id Software, who created the original game, quite publicly stated that they were not involved with the film in any way. Sales were disappointing, and the reviews were decent, but not great. Depending upon who you talked to, it was sometimes called a better film in comparison to the original, but one that doesn't match the source material as much, and one that is a whole hell of a lot less fun. We go now to everyone's favorite year, 2020, and even though the Resident Evil series was done, Anderson and Jovovich were still going at the video game adaptation thing with Monster Hunter. This was adapted from a series of games that began back in 2004 with the same name and was a role-playing game where hunters traveled around and battled large monsters. The series involves a group of people from our world being transported to the world from the game series and being forced to face off against a number of massive creatures. Along with Jovovich, it would star Tony Jaa, Ron Perlman, and Megan Good, and was a project that Anderson had been trying to get made since 2012. It had a budget of $60 million, similar to that of several of their RE entries, but then the problem arose. It was scheduled to be released in September of 2020, but that plan was derailed by COVID, and it was bumped to April of 2021, but then pulled back up to December of 2020, and things were still a bit uneasy, and people still weren't going to theaters. It ended up massively underperforming and only brought in around $50 million around the world, and the reviews were fairly mixed, and even though Anderson was hoping for a sequel, it appears unlikely. Here we go into 2021 now, and it's a much smaller entry with Werewolves Within. This is from a game from 2016 that was actually a VR game that was for the Oculus and PlayStation VR, where you would deduct which of your players was a werewolf, and was set in a fantasy medieval town. It was announced that there would be a film version, although it's mostly pretty loose in terms of adaptation. Josh Rubin directed, and if you haven't seen his film Scare Me, I highly recommend that one, and he has a pretty sharp sense of humor, which is on display in this movie as well. Veep's Sam Richardson would take the lead along with Milena Vaintrub, and very different than the game, it's set in a small town, and a forest ranger and mail carrier have to team up to figure out which of the town members is a secret lycanthrope. It had a budget of around $6 million and had a small theatrical run, mostly art house theaters, and then would show up on demand. It did really well on there and received some really solid reviews all around, although at this point, no further entries have been announced. Well, I know that I said that we already did Resident Evil The Final Chapter, but of course, that ended up not being true, because in 2021, there was a reboot of the franchise called Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Neither Anderson nor Jovovich would be involved this time around, and since there were many complaints that the original series strayed so far from the inspiration, the attempt was made to keep it closer to the source material and adapt the actual games. Johannes Roberts would take over directing, and he also wrote it, and he had previously done the 47 Meters Down movies, and also The Strangers Pray at Night. And when he came on board, they tossed aside a different script by Greg Russo that was said to be brutal, horrifying, but the studio was unimpressed by it and wanted massive changes, so he left the project. In this version, we have new versions of many of the characters, including Kaya Scodelario as Claire Redfield and Robbie Amell as Chris Redfield, and it had a moderate budget of $25 million, less than the original films, and it didn't do that well on release, but was profitable at $42 million. However, reviews were merely lukewarm. Franchise fans didn't care all that much for it. And even though there's lots of discussion of various ways to carry the series forward, nothing has materialized. Our final entry here was from 2023, and it's Five Nights at Freddy's, which was a long in gestation film that adapted a game series that began back in 2014. It's a game where you're a security guard at a pizza joint that features an animatronic band that comes to life and kills at night. And there's a dozen or more different editions of it at the current time. Plans for a movie began back in 2015, but one thing or another delayed it, and it took close to 10 years for it to materialize. Emma Tammy landed the directing job, and she tried to make it fairly faithful, but also made changes to give it a fresh experience for those that already knew the game. Josh Hutcherson took the lead role, and Matthew Lillard would appear, as would Mary Stuart Masterson, and the film also featured cameos from a number of YouTubers who focused on Freddy's lore. The budget was moderate at $20 million, and it would play both in theaters as well as simultaneously screening on Peacock, and was a monster hit. Even though the reviews weren't kind and fans seemed to be split on it, it would bring in close to $300 million worldwide. And there's more on the way. I don't know if you want to include Borderlands as any sort of horror, but that comes out this year. And there's a Bendy in the Ink Machine movie in the works, a Dead by Daylight movie, Duke Nukem, more Five Nights at Freddy's, Iron Lung, Poppy Playtime, and Until Dawn, all with upcoming adaptations in the works. So there you have it, a whole roster of horror movies that are based on horror video games. And again, I know that there's some in there that are strictly Japanese films that I didn't cover, like Fatal Frame and things like that weren't on this list because of that. And also, yes, there's a whole bunch of Resident Evil animated films. I know that as well too. Those aren't covered here. But let me know any of the other ones that you think that I missed. Let me know any other horror games that were made into movies that maybe I'm not aware of, but I think I got them all. Pretty sure. But if I didn't, let me know down below. And of course, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you like the channel, hit that subscribe button. If you like me, go to patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel like these guys do. I appreciate that very, very much. It's an awesome thing to do, and it's a lot of fun, and we've got a cool little community going on over there. But also, keep on coming back and watching these videos. I certainly appreciate that as well, and we'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot, guys, and bye-bye.